But as I was sort of wandering around Athens, sort of retracing Plato's footsteps, it really struck me very strongly that actually the academy itself is a profoundly civic space.
Welcome to Lesche, a podcast on new ideas in ancient Greek studies. I'm your host, Johanna Hanning, and I'm a classicist at Brown University. So it turns out that February is sort of a Socrates-themed month here on the pod. On the last episode, we discussed Josh Billings and Christopher Moore's new Cambridge Companion to the Sophists, and today's episode is dedicated to Plato, who, more than any other single author, was responsible for crafting our enduring notions about just who and what the Sophists were. Plato is a figure that looms so large in the history of Western philosophy that it can be easy to forget he was a citizen of the classical Athenian democracy, that he would have served in the military, voted in the assembly, watched the tragedies and comedies at the great theater festivals, and so on and so forth. He was born, raised, and shaped by the particular circumstances of Athens in the late 5th and early 4th centuries BCE, and his life spanned a period of tremendous upheaval in his native city. He was born during the Peloponnesian War. He witnessed Athens' defeat and the brief but traumatic reign of the 30 tyrants, and he lived through the city's partial recovery and transformation in the 4th century. In her new book, Plato, A Civic Life, Carol Atack offers a fresh perspective on Plato by placing him firmly within the context of his lived experience as an Athenian citizen. Rather than treating Plato's philosophy as something that transcended its historical moment or is separable from its historical moment, Carol shows how deeply Plato's thought was influenced by and responsive to the political and social realities of Athens, its democratic institutions, its educational practices, its imperial ambitions, and ultimately its civic failures. What emerges in Carol's book is a Plato who was not merely responding to abstract philosophical questions, but to the concrete challenges facing his city and himself as a citizen of it. His development of the Socratic dialogue as a philosophical method, his creation of an imagined perfect city in the Republic, his reflections on justice and virtue, all of these, Carol argues in her book, were profoundly shaped by Plato's experiences as an Athenian citizen witnessing his city's struggles. This contextual approach helps explain why Plato would create a philosophical system that was simultaneously critical of Athenian democracy and yet deeply engaged with civic questions. It also illuminates why he chose to develop philosophy not as a set of doctrines, but as a practice, and a practice of dialogue, a form that, like the tragic agon, mirrored the rhetorical and conversational culture of Athenian public life. So I very much hope that you enjoy this conversation that we had about him. Carol Atack is a fellow and director of studies and classics at Newnham College, Cambridge. Her books include Plato, A Civic Life, Xenophon, which appeared also in 2024 in the Greece and Rome New Surveys in the Classics series, and also the Discourse of Kingship in Classical Greece from 2019, which was based on her doctoral research. She's published many articles and chapters on classical Greek political thought and its modern reception, on topics ranging from free speech through utopian thought to radical contemporary readings of Greek political thought. She's currently working on a monograph on the temporality of Plato's dialogues. Just a quick note to say that, as always, I've put some references in the show notes for you. So now I'd like to welcome into the Lesche Carol Atack. The next voice you'll be hearing is hers.
Paul Cartledge approached me and asked me if I'd write a life for the series. And at first I wasn't quite sure who I would like to work on, but Plato made obvious sense. Plato's been a focus of my research for some time and continues to be so. I'm fascinated both by his ideas, the thoughts he came up with, his position in Athens at a period of intense political activity and change, but also the way in which he writes, the way in which he kind of hides himself in his own writing. So actually approaching him from the completely different direction of writing a biography was an interesting way to unpack some of the things that I'd been thinking about in reading his dialogues that hadn't really come out in my more academic writing on Plato.
To what extent do you think that in work on Plato on the philosophical side, the historical side, so the biographical tradition for him is taken seriously? How historically have these two sides of Plato interacted in the scholarship?
Well, I think that's something that's changed over time, over the long history of Plato being read. There's a rich biographical tradition in later antiquity that's enmeshed very closely with ways in which Plato's dialogues were read in that time. So you see a lot of trying to find numerological significance in dates related to Plato, in anecdotes about his life dating from times when Neoplatonism, which added a kind of layer of numerological mysticism to the dialogues, was in place. So at times, Plato's life has been very central to how the dialogues were read. I think in the 20th century in particular, and in particular in Anglophone scholarship, there's been a real tendency to kind of try and take the philosophy out of the dialogues and to kind of almost denature them so that you're just looking at ideas in the abstract, that they belong to Plato, that they come from a setting in a dialogue, for example, was kind of set to one side in the pursuit of the philosophical ideas, this idea that you could kind of extract a system of thought that you could then look at and analyze using modern philosophical approaches. And there's been a big reaction to that too. So perhaps the system in which I studied Plato at Cambridge is very much more contextualist, very much more drawing on that Cambridge school tradition of intellectual history and political thought, where understanding the context in which writers operated, the people they interacted with, the predecessors on whom they draw, the people who they're communicating with, are really an important resource for understanding what they have to say to the world. So that, I think, was also an important factor, sort of trying to bring that in and apply it to Plato's life.
In terms of your own framework, it seems, or it strikes me, that the subtitle for your book, Plato, A Civic Life, is actually, it reflects an important and careful choice of words. Could you gloss that a little bit? Could you say a little bit about how you chose that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that was really important to me and that most struck me as I was researching the book was the way in which our kind of tradition sees Plato as having stepped back from civic life and having withdrawn from direct engagement. And there's a sense in which that's true, in that he didn't directly hold major political office in Athens. We've no knowledge of him following in the footsteps even of some of his own relatives. And of course, there's a good contextual reason for that. His family had got involved in politics in some of the turmoil in a way that perhaps made it difficult for him to enter the political fray with a clean sheet. But as I was sort of wandering around Athens, sort of retracing Plato's footsteps, it really struck me very strongly that actually the academy itself is a profoundly civic space, one in which citizens went to learn to become citizens. So, both physical training to prepare themselves for participation in military service, which of course was a fundamental activity for Athenian citizens, but also studying and intellectual development of the kind that enabled them to participate in the political life of the city effectively. So I wanted to kind of assert Plato's place in that. Obviously, he was training people who went on to become generals, who went on to become politicians. He also trained people who went to undertake political roles in their own cities. So it seemed to me that working on that idea that Plato was very much involved with how to live in a city was made a lot of sense for thinking about, I mean, works like the Republic, which are very much about thinking how a city might work. And that seems a current that runs through Plato's work. So, yeah, I mean, both in his writing and in his actual interactions with the city in which he lived, it seemed to me that he was profoundly enmeshed in the civic life of Athens.
Well, you mentioned his family and how his particular family tree and family circumstances made it difficult or sort of prove complicating factors for him in terms of if he wanted a political career. Could you speak just a little bit about who his family was, and then, perhaps leading up into the context of his childhood and how he first encountered Socrates?
Yeah, so Plato is born into a family that is of some substance and long tradition. Athens doesn't really have a formal aristocracy at the time in which Plato is born, but there are clearly families who can trace a long ancestry involving past members of the family taking part in public service in various ways. The actual circumstances of Plato's own birth remain a bit mysterious. His father, Ariston, there's one tradition that Ariston had taken his family off to settle on a nearby island, another tradition that they're still in Athens. But Ariston is married to Perictione, and I'll say that's the name we conventionally use for her. Sources do differ on this. Perictione is a member of another, perhaps even more elite, more well established family in which many of its members had engaged in distinguished service to the city over the years. So when Plato, for example, has the character Critias in his dialogue, the Timaeus, talk about a family memory of hearing the reformer Solon speak about the past of Athens, he's almost inserting his own family history into his work and offering it as a replacement to other Athenian traditions. So yeah, a wealthy family, one with some resources, with many members participating in politics. So Critias, for example, became one of the leaders of the 30 tyrants who were put in place in Athens at the end of the Peloponnesian War and ruled badly, leading to a civil war, a violent and bloody civil war in which Critias himself was killed. And this happened at a time when Plato was possibly still a teenager, possibly in his early 20s.
One of the things that you discuss in the book is how his early years and how his formation then sort of reemerges, I guess, in some ways in the settings of the dialogues, in the civic spaces in which
Mm-hmm.
the participants speak to each other. Could you draw that out a little bit for listeners? I mean, what kinds of settings are we seeing that seem to
Right.
maybe evoke these civic spaces that Plato would have been very familiar with from his own experience?
When Plato comes to write the dialogues, he's looking back to the past, and he's looking back to different layers of the past. It's very hard to pin down historical settings for the dialogues, and I'm not even sure that that's quite the right thing to do. They're a kind of imagined version of the past. I think, roughly speaking, before the bad things happened. And sometimes the bad things are simply the death of Socrates in 399. Sometimes they're other disasters which occurred to Athens, the loss of the Peloponnesian War, the end of the Sicilian expedition, reaching back even further, the plague which hit Athens at the start of the Peloponnesian War. And that seems to have been a traumatic incident, probably a few years before Plato's birth, but which he grew up in. He emerged into the aftermath of it. It must have affected his family as it affected every family in Athens. And we see that in the dialogues where characters are put together. So my feeling about the trauma of the plague being reflected in the dialogues you see in the Protagoras, where two of the characters are the sons of Pericles who had died in the plague, and they're sort of standing around in the background. They're almost a ghostly presence in the dialogue, and at the same time, both Socrates and his interlocutor Protagoras, the educator and sophist, themselves both dead, long dead at the time at which Plato's writing. So he's looking back into a past. It's very hard to pin down precise dates. It's a kind of imaginary world in which, as I say, it's before the bad things had happened. But I think what's really important is that although it's not an attempt to recreate, for example, what happened when Protagoras came to Athens, it's an attempt to explore ideas of interest to Plato by imagining a conversation taking place in that imagined world.
This speaks to the overarching framework of the book. There's the philosophical ideas expressed in the dialogues, but there's also the really important framework of the historical settings, which are not themselves straightforward, which you discuss. And I do want to kind of come back to the linear progression of Plato's life, but at this point, I would be curious to hear your take on why Plato does people the dialogues. I mean, with so many figures of the past, sort of why he intertwines his presentation of these philosophical ideas being drawn out through dialogue with so much information or so much rooting in the Athenian past. And I guess related to that, I would be curious to hear your take on what people have identified as, the anachronism of the ways in which he sometimes does that. Like, in the Menexenus, that where the funeral oration Socrates gives goes to a couple of decades after Socrates himself dies. Or you write about how the Symposium seems to have, sort of nods to things going on well past, again, Socrates' death. So, yeah, do you mind just speaking a little bit to the way that the historical Athens and the philosophical, this world of ideas, are interacting in the dialogues?
Sure. Well, to start with the idea of anachronism, people have been aware of anachronism in Plato's dialogues since antiquity. They've been commenting on it. And that was one of my routes into thinking about how the dialogues worked as a whole. I worked for a few years in Oxford on a project called Anachronism and Antiquity. And one of the things I was doing was looking at how philosophical dialogue worked and why the use of characters from the past is so important in it. I mean, there must be multiple reasons why this practice arose. I mean, one influence must surely have been Athenian drama and the use of not so much the use of mythical characters in tragedy, which is another way in which Athenians liked to think about political issues of the present through an imagined past, but the practice in comedy of presenting people from the past, seeing the city literally looking to the past. So Aristophanes' frogs going down to the underworld to fetch back some poets to provide moral advice for the city. That, I think, must be an influence. But Plato isn't the only writer of dialogues, and he is engaged in, I mean, we don't know when Plato started writing, the biographical tradition suggests it might even have been before Socrates' death, but certainly after Socrates died, a number of his followers start trying to capture their experience with Socrates in writing, in dialogue form. And it becomes a kind of almost a competitive game. We see we see different writers, so people like Xenophon, whose dialogues we have more or less complete, people like Antisthenes, who we have fragments, quotations from. We see them carefully using characters as part of the kind of argumentative setup of what they're trying to do. So often there's a point being made by the choice of characters to feature in the dialogue. Actually, reading Xenophon's Memorabilia is really instructive for this because there are points where he's clearly critiquing Plato. There's one dialogue where Plato's brother Glaucon is the interlocutor and sort of represents a kind of ambitious young man of means trying to push himself to the political forefront in a way that's not entirely apt. So there are lots of reasons why Plato might do this. And I think that he often is looking for his own philosophical roots in exploring these questions and thinking about what it might mean to set Socrates' ideas in dialogue with those of other schools of thought, for example. So we see that perhaps more in the dialogues he wrote as he in what we sort of conventionally think of as his middle and later period, and where he seems to have really settled into a rhythm of how to write, how to construct a dialogue. So dialogues like the Parmenides, which is philosophically very rich and difficult, but actually it's setting with Socrates in conversation with a group of young men who've assembled to meet the visiting educators Parmenides and Zeno. That sort of shows Plato testing out his own ideas against the ideas associated with Parmenides and Zeno and kind of seeing how they stack up. So there's a bit of intellectual game playing as well as I think some genuine affection for people from the past and a desire. I mean, the obvious desire is to commemorate Socrates, but there are a lot of other people. I mean, and some of whom Plato can't have known himself, who were who must have been he must have heard of secondhand, but whose work he'd admired. I mean, so both Protagoras and Parmenides would come into that kind of category. Plato clearly read their work and he presents them as characters, I think, through interest and affection, but also because placing two people in conversation is a really good way of putting their ideas into debate with each other.
Well, since you've mentioned Antisthenes and Xenophon, could you say a little bit more about Socrates' circle, or sort of the context in which Socrates was moving while he was still alive? How do you think Plato would have first encountered him? What did it maybe look like or feel like to hang out with Socrates? You write about this very persuasively in the book.
Yeah, it's I mean, and again, the biographical tradition really tries to mystify the meeting of Plato and Socrates into some kind of grand event. And it seems to me much more likely that Plato must have first learned of Socrates from his older brothers, who would have encountered Socrates, who was, an itinerant street philosopher and eager to engage people in conversation and seemed to be hanging around the spaces in which elite young men were completing their education training. So I think the setup of dialogues And some of Plato's earlier dialogues, like the Charmides, in which Socrates speaks with two of Plato's older relatives, Charmides and Critias, in the changing room of a gym, that seems to me to be very likely the kind of space in which Plato might first have encountered Socrates.
If we think about, I suppose, Socrates' other very famous students who go on to write about him and
Yeah,
whose works we have, could you just say a little bit about how you position, say, Plato in relation to Xenophon and Isocrates? Why does it seem that each of these writers slash thinkers has such a different take on the Socratic legacy or sort of what that experience had been?
I think that is one of the big questions that is really difficult to answer. Looking at it in a very contextual way, a lot of these people are trying to lay hold of the Socratic tradition as a kind of way of bolstering their own position as educators, their own claim to intellectual authority. People who are working as educators have an interest in laying hold of the Socratic, claiming to be the heirs of Socrates. And that's kind of the way in which ancient philosophy, ancient education works, this idea of there being a school that has authority transmitted from one generation to the next is something that is kind of emerging at this time, and I think is retrospectively applied to some of these thinkers. I mean, of course, Xenophon wasn't an educator, and we don't really know quite how or why Xenophon wanted to involve himself in this debate, but he clearly did think it was important enough to intervene in writing with a counter critique of Plato's writing. So there's, yeah, a kind of competitive interest. The 19th century sort of desire to find the real Socrates subjected all of these authors to a kind of source analysis to sort of find the real Socrates. And I'm not sure that that's actually something that's possible. All of these Socrates are constructed by authors attempting to lay hold of tradition, and Plato's Socrates is slanted towards Plato's needs and interests as Xenophon's is. I think that might be a fairly controversial point to make because I've sat in many seminars where people have said Plato has a much more sophisticated Socrates. Xenophon's Socrates is much simpler. You know, one must be right, the other must be wrong. But they're both doing things with Socrates. I'm sure that Plato, with his profound interest in hard philosophical problems, reflects that in a more sophisticated Socrates, and may well reflect elements of a Socrates that passed Xenophon with his much more practical and down to earth issues by. But nonetheless, they're both characters created by authors.
Characters created by authors writing in a time period. Well, I mean, I guess I would assume that probably for a lot of listeners, they're already familiar with the circumstances of the trial of Socrates and the political aspect too of his accusers and that past. But I think what people might be less familiar with, and which you really draw out, is the context of the early 4th century and those historical circumstances. So could you maybe speak a little bit in particular about the Corinthian War and that as the backdrop for the emergence of, say, Xenophon and Plato as authors writing Socratic dialogue?
Well, again, this is a period of Athenian history where our sources are not awesomely great, and our knowledge of what Plato is doing in this period is really quite poor. Also, much mythicized by the biographical tradition, which sees him leaving Athens in a sort of disgust. My sense is that Plato, obviously did travel, obviously did meet with other philosophers through this period in the 390s, 380s, but there are challenges to traveling at certain points where war is interrupting the usual routes. One interesting thing is that it's possible that Plato and Xenophon may have fought on different sides in this war. We have no direct evidence for Plato undertaking military service, but it seems highly improbable that an able-bodied man, the biographical tradition is very strong on Plato's physical prowess in wrestling, for example. It seems highly improbable that at a time when a city that is pretty low on manpower is at war, he would not have participated in that in some respect. Xenophon, of course, had left Athens before Socrates' death, possibly for economic reasons, possibly because of being sidelined from the possibility of political office through actions during the period of the 30. He undertakes the expedition that he writes about in his Anabasis, falls in with the Spartans, serves with their king, come in Asia Minor, comes back to Greece with Agesilaus, and the biographical tradition suggests that he fought on the Spartan side in battles in which there was an Athenian presence on the other side. And that means that Xenophon is exiled from Athens. And again, we don't know how formal that was, but he certainly was away from Athens for a long time and not there in the city, participating in that sort of vibrant life of education and training in which Plato's participating directly. So I see Plato as starting to write in that period where as that intellectual life starts revving up in Athens. And I think that it's actually much more interesting to think about how Plato operates in that world than to imagine him as being removed from it. And that does cause there are some issues with the biographical tradition. The big question is Plato's visits to Sicily, what he did there, whether he actually went or not. If he did go, what was he doing? So lots of problems for which there is very little firm evidence to guide us.
I think that, though, regardless of, what the actual dates were for any of Plato's particular travels or even Xenophon, one thing that your book really brought out for me, which I guess I hadn't quite internalized in quite this way before, is that this is the period, and it really seems like with this group of people, of Socrates' successors or students, former students, there emerges a kind of republic of letters in Greece.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really striking. So, if Xenophon is writing some of his memorabilia from his, beautiful estate near Olympia, right? He's somehow getting Plato's writings transmitted to him. And, the same with Isocrates is, writing these speeches that kind of, that do pose as assembly speeches, but we suspect weren't actually being delivered in the assembly. So it seems that which is also, of course, very ironic given the Socratic view of writing and not being able to respond to authors and submit them to a Lenkos and all that kind of stuff. But could you say a little bit about that? Because I don't think that we really see something like that before this, where there's really intellectual debate. It really is a republic of letters that's connecting these people.
Yeah, that is absolutely one of the most fascinating things about this period in 4th century Greece, that we do have these writers working at the same time and that we have texts that respond to each other transmitted to us. So we can read Plato's Symposium, which which engages with various thinkers and their ideas, sets out various characters. Um, then we can read Xenophon's Symposium, which operates as a critique of Plato's Symposium. We can read Isocrates against the sophists, which identifies different kinds of educators and takes a critical view of them, including Plato was one of those groups. We can read Plato's Euthydemus, in which an extreme kind of heuristic, violent argument, um, logic chopping is set against Socrates, who actually operates more by persuasion and charm. And so, again, two different approaches to education, which then are joined in a coda by a discussion of a character whom everybody by and large agrees must be Isocrates. So a lot of, and then there's the Plato's discussion of Lysias and Isocrates crops up in the Phaedrus, for example. So there's a lot of very conscious interaction between these writers. They're also commenting on earlier traditions, they comment on Homer, they comment on drama. They're very much operating in a cultural environment in which there's a lot of shared knowledge, a lot of shared texts to discuss, and they're also engaged in argument with each other. And I think it's absolutely fascinating that we can look at texts written in this context of pretty profound change in classical Greece as different cities become more powerful. There's the rise of Macedon to the north. There's a lot going on that makes the sort of consideration of how to organize your city, how to educate its leaders, how to persuade people to participate in politics are really important live questions in that fourth century context. So yeah, I think that a big message that I would really hope people take from the book is, read Plato with an eye to the fourth century and treat the fifth century settings as settings, but remember that what's being discussed are issues and debates of the fourth century, of the time at which Plato's actually writing his texts.
Well, one of the points you also draw out in the book is that Plato's own intellectual formation hardly ended with the death of Socrates. And then it's really that afterwards, he's, through his travels and through his lifelong learning, I guess, he's, exploring his curiosity with Pythagoreanism. He's encountering other philosophical traditions that he is kind of bringing then into the Socratic circle and putting to the test in terms of Socrates' ideas. Could you speak a little bit about what sort of post-Socratic philosophical elements then we find Plato introducing into the dialogues?
Sure. And it's a very interesting sort of journey as different currents start to weave their way into the dialogues, and we see some of them recur again and again. So you mentioned Pythagoreanism, and Plato is really interested in the ideas of thinkers from Italy, from Magna Graecia, from the Greek colonies of Italy. And I think that it's not just a philosophical interest, it's also a religious interest. And there, Pythagoreanism, with its doctrines of the afterlife and reincarnation, start to play a really important part in his work. So you see that in dialogues like the Phaedo, for example, where there's a big Pythagorean influence at play. Pythagoreanism itself is a very complicated structure. There's the kind of religious beliefs, the ethical beliefs, the lifestyle, but there's also a real interest in mathematics. And we see that interest start coming out in Plato's work. So a big figure, I think almost somebody whom Plato may have seen as a rival outside Athens, is Alcaitas of Tarentum, who, unlike Plato, did achieve political office in his city. So wasn't just a philosopher, was also a ruler, but also had profound things to say about political and social life, and also, along with other Pythagoreans, an interest in mathematics too. Then, as once Plato establishes the academy in Athens, that is, sets up a kind of research institute at the edge of the academy training ground and starts attracting intellectuals from across the Greek world, we start seeing other figures come and bring new ideas into place. So, an important person is Eudoxus, again, a mathematician who, from his arrival, we start seeing much more interest in mathematics in Plato's own work. So Plato himself, not a gifted mathematician in his own right, but with a keen appreciation of the importance of mathematics for understanding how the cosmos works, and so how the divine order of the cosmos might be replicated in the human sphere. And even if perhaps even a little bit later, as Plato reaches old age, uh, one of his students who arrived, Aristotle, clearly starts responding to Plato, and you can read parts of some of Plato's very late works, like the Laws, almost as being in dialogue with parts of Aristotle's own writings, the Politics, discussing taking a fresh look on how to set up and run a city on ideal lines.
Well, yeah, in the discussion that I had with John Ma about his Polis book, one of the things that we talked about was because he uses Aristotle as kind of a key fellow thinker in that, but is Aristotle's own lifetime as being at this really interesting political juncture in Greece.
Mm-hmm.
So I was wondering if you could maybe say a little bit about, Plato in his later years, how you see the evolution of Greece. We're after this age of, we're sort of the age of, these competing Greek hegemonies is drawing to a close. Macedon is on the rise. Athens' attempt at rebuilding some version, some ghost of the empire, whatever, bringing that back to life has failed. So how do you see those elements of, I guess, Greek history in that those later years as having shaped Plato's thought, Plato's last dialogues, or even how we see Plato?
The obvious dialogue to look at for that is the Laws, which is the bulkiest of Plato's works and possibly one of the more challenging ones to read. It's not the most reader friendly of works. Plato imagines an elderly Athenian joining elderly Cretan and Spartan to walk to the cave on the mountain in Crete, where Zeus is worshipped, and he writes the conversation they have along the way, and in doing so discusses the ways in which different political regimes have failed and the way in which a new society might be set up. And he still draws very heavily on Athenian practice in thinking about the details of how that society might operate, while also, I think one thing that's very clear in the Laws is the failure of Sparta, which had been a political ideal for, what one might call conservative Athenians, obviously from the time of the end of the Peloponnesian War and the Spartan imposed regime of the 30 to the period of Spartan hegemony in the Greek world, which had really by then come, by the 360s, had come to a crashing end. So if you were thinking of Sparta as your political ideal earlier in your life, by the time Plato's writing his later works, that really won't do anymore. But there's also the figure of, well, is monarchy an option? That on the horizon, looking at Philip and Macedon, looking at the rise of some of the powerful autocratic rulers whom Xenophon documents, looking at people like Dionysius II of Sicily, whom, of course, the later tradition places Plato in close dialogue with, probably imaginatively. So there's a lot of change there, and perhaps again I think that we have to look to Aristotle's Politics to kind of see that really playing out a bit more. Plato dies before Athens is defeated by Macedon, so doesn't really see that world going forward. I mean, and actually, you can see a lot of that post later tradition, and I see pseudo-Platonic works like the Seventh Letter very much doing that work of adapting Plato's political philosophy, very focused on how democratic, independent Athens should work, and placing it into that context of either the polis with a single ruler at the helm, or the polis as part of a federation, possibly with some kind of empire or monarchy sitting on top of it, the framework that we see in the Hellenistic and later world. So the sense in which some of Plato's thought doesn't really fit that later context. And actually, what's really interesting is how writers in subsequent generations adapt that thought into the later world.
I think it's right that the Laws is the only dialogue of Plato's that survives that in which Socrates is wholly absent. Right. So what do you make of that?
It's hard. I mean, it's hard to know. I mean, we don't know who. I mean, there are many dialogue of the later dialogues. Socrates takes a back seat. He sits and listens to the other characters discuss. So that's particularly true in dialogues like the Sophist. Sometimes we have a Socrates who, so in the Phaedrus, for example, we have a Socrates who some people have seen as a very much simply a cipher for Plato himself. Um, it's very hard to know why Socrates has disappeared from the scene, and the why the anonymity of the Athenian visitor in the um, in the Laws, but and I don't really have an answer for the whys of that. Um, but I think that Plato, I mean, there's a sense in which he can't put Socrates in Crete because Socrates famously only left Athens on military service, so that even when Socrates steps outside the city walls in the Phaedrus, he remarks on that being quite an unusual thing for him to do. So, there's a sense in which Plato perhaps doesn't want to be limited by the kind of restrictions of the character he's created. But I wouldn't want to suggest that the Athenian stranger is a kind of slightly denatured Socrates, or represents some other Athenian thinker, or even represents Plato directly himself.
one thing I'm really curious about was whether in the course of researching and writing this book, there was anything that really surprised you or anything big that you maybe changed your mind about, any assumptions that you had brought into it that you felt were overturned by your work.
I think I was really, reading through very carefully because that we have so much evidence from that period, from Plato's birth in the 420s through that period of the Peloponnesian War, um, up to the death of Socrates. We do have a lot of evidence for that. And I think really understanding the extent to which Plato's life and upbringing were enmeshed with the fortunes of the city, and that must have played such an important part on him. I think also the centrality of loss to his life, the repeated bereavements, the loss of his father, then his stepfather, then the loss of Socrates. And clearly there must have been other losses beside. So, I mean, characters like Theaetetus in the Theaetetus, who died relatively young on military service. So I think that preoccupation with loss and commemoration, I think, was really brought home to me. But also another thing, I mean, later in Plato's life, really kind of how entrepreneurial he was in establishing a place in which, I mean, I say entrepreneurial because this wasn't really a business enterprise. I mean, it was more, I think, what we now term a lifestyle business,
Yeah.
in that
Plato's
Plato,
lifestyle coach. I like that.
yeah, well, Plato liked, well, I mean, a lifestyle business in that it turns the founder's hobby into something they can generate some money from that makes that hobby self-sustaining.
Like
So,
goop.
yeah,
Just kidding.
well, I mean, but with, I mean, fewer crystals, more scrolls.
Right.
But yeah, that, that bringing people together and benefiting from those interactions, I think was really important. And for Athens, as its political role declined in the later centuries, its status as a place to which people came for higher education, I mean, that became one of its most important functions in later antiquity, in the Roman period. For example, I mean, you see Augustus coming to Rome, you see Augustus coming to Athens, Hadrian coming to Athens, you know, Cicero and Atticus, that whole sense of Athens as an intellectual base for philosophical schools. Really, Plato does a big part of the work in setting that up. So, yeah, I think actually seeing Plato as a kind of innovator, when, you know, in so many ways he's very conservative and looking to the past, I think actually, yeah, that he's a real innovator is very important.
Well, that was a nice turn, I thought, in the last chapter of your book, which has been so much about how Athens and the people that Plato met and the other places that he traveled to had left, shaped Plato's thought. But you really leave us with this very helpful reminder, very salutary reminder that Plato really left his mark on Athens in return, that a lot of the Athens, whatever that word conjures for us today, is because of what Plato did.
Yeah, I mean, we've not really talked very much about how Plato writes and how vivid his work is and how powerful his characters are and how engaging. And you really get a really strong picture of a world that it must have been exciting to be in. And people have valued that ever ever since, and people have taken very different things away from Plato's work over the centuries, and different dialogues have kind of come into the forefront of his work, been the ones that people have really read at different times. So it's not a, it's not a fixed tradition. And I really wanted to close the book by showing that there were very different ways in which people engaged with Plato's work, but also that writing their own responses wasn't to Plato's Republic, engaging with his ideas through their own writing, that it's a very dialogic process that continues.
Well, thank you very much, Carol, for this conversation. I was hoping that we could close with the podcast word association game.
Sure.
Okay, so I'm just going to say a few words, and just if you could just respond with whatever comes to mind first, and we'll just move through them rapid fire. So the first I have is Socrates.
Ooh. Death.
The Academy.
Learning.
Callipolis.
That's a difficult one. I'm going to say women.
The Phaedo.
Apollo.
And finally, Plato.
Beauty.
Well, thank you so much, Carol. Those were great answers.
Well, thank you. Yeah, that was interesting.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Lesche podcast. And special thanks for their support of the podcast to the Brown University Department of Classics and the John Nicholas Brown Center for Advanced Study. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. And we'd be grateful if you take a moment to rate the podcast and leave a review. It will help other listeners to find us. We look forward to you joining us again soon here in the Lesche.